Picture this, okay. New York City, 1836. Gas lamps, cobblestone streets, horse-drawn carriages, and a murder that's about to grip the whole nation. But this isn't just any murder, no, no, no. This one, it goes deep, exposes the city's underbelly, sparks a media frenzy, and the killer, well, they might just get away with it.
The murder of Helen Jewett.
Yeah.
A turning point, not just for criminal justice, but for journalism itself, how it all changes.
Exactly, and we're diving deep, right? Using a fascinating source, a Spanish Wikipedia article about Helen. It's a unique perspective on this very American story.
It's amazing how this one event connects to bigger changes happening in society, like newspapers, right?
Yeah.
Suddenly, they're hungry for readers, using shocking crime stories to sell copies, almost like, the early days of tabloids.
So get ready, we're uncovering the facts of the murder, the trial of the accused, and the media storm that followed. We'll also see how this case changed how news is reported. Forever. Ready to jump in.
Absolutely. But first, to understand this, we need to understand Helen Jewett. She was more than just a victim. She led a really complex life.
All right, so let's start at the beginning. Born Dorcas Doyen in Maine, 1813. Tough start, right? Father struggled with alcohol. She lost her mother young. But still, she ends up working for a prominent judge, Chief Justice Nathan Weston, no less. That's pretty impressive, wouldn't you say?
It is. But even early on, there are signs of, a rebellious side. At 18, she leaves the judge's home and things change. She heads to Portland, Maine, takes on a new name, Helen Jewett, and starts working as a prostitute.
Whoa, a total transformation. And she keeps reinventing herself, right? Moving to Boston, then New York City, continuing down this path.
Now, it's tempting to judge, through our modern lens. But back then, early 1800s, a woman's options, outside of marriage, extremely limited. Helen, it seems, was determined to make her own way, finding control in a world that offered women very little.
Carving out a life for herself, even if it wasn't ideal. But tragically, her life is cut short in the most brutal way imaginable.
April 10th, 1836, 3 a.m. The brothel's madam, Rosina Townsend, discovers Helen's body.
Gruesome scene, bludgeoned 3 times in the head. The forensic report even mentions an axe or a cleaver. And to cover it up, they set her bed on fire.
The brutality and that attempted cover-up, shocking even now. What stands out, though, is the lack of a struggle, suggests a surprise attack by someone she knew, someone she maybe even trusted.
And here's where things get interesting, right? Hunter Richard P. Robinson, 19 years old, a frequent client of Helen's.
Robinson becomes the prime suspect. Police rely on testimonies from other women in the brothel. Plus, a cloak, similar to his, is found at the scene.
But here's the thing. Robinson insists he's innocent the whole time. And reports say he seems, emotionless. So what do you think? Guilty or just good at hiding his feelings?
Hard to tell. But this sets the stage for a trial that becomes a media sensation. Starts June 2nd, 1836. Robinson has a top-notch defense attorney ready to fight.
This trial, it's full of twists. Witness testimonies, including one from Rosina Townsend, the madam. But get this, the judge tells the jury to ignore them, just because of their profession.
Pure bias against sex workers. Plain and simple. Their voices, their experiences, deemed irrelevant because of their work.
Unbelievable, right? Makes you think how deep those prejudices ran. Their testimonies, unreliable just because of who they were.
A stark example of how marginalized groups were treated, even in the legal system. And in under 90 minutes, the jury reaches a verdict. Not guilty.
Not guilty. Can you believe it? It makes you wonder if the power dynamics, the societal biases, swayed things.
It really does. But the story doesn't end there. The murder of Helen Jewett becomes a national obsession, and the newspapers go crazy.
It's like the birth of tabloid journalism, right? James Gordon Bennett Sr.'s New York Herald, extensive coverage, but definitely biased. He paints Robinson as the victim caught in a web of lies.
Meanwhile, the New York Sun, targeting a working-class audience, tells a different story. They say Robinson, privileged kid, used his wealth and connections to get away with murder. 2 versions, feeding the public's hunger for scandal.
The power of the media shaping public opinion. This case sets a precedent for sensationalized reporting. Crime and scandal, selling papers, a trend that's, still around today.
And here's a fascinating detail. This case might be the first ever newspaper interview. James Gordon Bennett Sr. claimed to have interviewed Rosina Townsend, the madam. Imagine that, a groundbreaking moment in journalism.
Some say the interview was fake, hard to know for sure. But whatever the truth, this case changed how news is reported. A complete game changer.
And the story doesn't stop there. Robinson's personal letters come to light later, and they reveal a darker side to him. Public opinion shifts, turns against him.
Like, the truth comes out, but too late. He ends up moving to Texas, new life, new name, a redemption story maybe, but those doubts, they never really go away.
Ironic, isn't it? But the case still fascinates people. A novel written about it in 1849 even appears in Gore Vidal's Burr. The story of Helen Jewett and Richard Robinson, still captivating, even centuries later.
It's a story with so many layers, right? A brutal murder, a controversial trial, the rise of sensationalist journalism, and that lingering mystery. It really makes you think, doesn't it?
It does. And what strikes me is, Helen Jewett's story, despite being at the center of this national scandal, she's almost forgotten, overshadowed by Robinson, by the media frenzy.
Yeah, it's true. She becomes like a footnote in her own story. And that brings up a big question. Would the trial have gone differently if the key witnesses, if they weren't prostitutes, if their words had been taken seriously?
A question worth asking. The judge telling the jury to ignore their testimonies.
Yeah.
That shows the deep prejudice back then. Their experiences, their words discounted simply because of their profession. Makes you wonder how many other cases were decided, influenced by that same bias.
And how much has really changed,
Yeah.
When we report on crime, on scandals today, we have fancier technology, maybe a bit more awareness, but that urge to sensationalize, to focus on the juicy details, hasn't that always been a part of how we consume news?
It's a good point. Think about the cases that dominate the headlines now. Do we really prioritize the victim's stories? Or are we drawn to the drama, the intrigue, the whodunit aspect?
Definitely something to think about. But going back to Helen Jewett, her story says so much about the limited choices women faced back then, the societal judgments, trying to make her own way in a world that didn't offer much. And she paid the ultimate price.
Tragic, but it reminds us how important it is to, challenge those norms. Speak up for those who are marginalized, silenced. A conversation that's still relevant today.
Absolutely. So to everyone listening, we encourage you, dig deeper into this case. Helen Jewett's life, her times, read those original accounts, explore the different perspectives. It's a story that stays with you.
And maybe, most importantly, think about how it connects with the issues we face now. How far have we come? And what else needs to be done to ensure that every voice is heard, that justice is truly served?
We talked about the media frenzy, but let's dive deeper into how this specific case changed journalism itself.
This is where James Gordon Bennett Sr. and his New York Herald come in. He was a pioneer, you could say, of sensationalist journalism. He understood the public's appetite for scandal, and he used it.
So he wasn't just reporting the news, he was shaping it, playing on people's emotions, their biases.
Exactly. Vivid language, dramatic storytelling, even illustrations, all to capture attention. And he wasn't afraid to push the boundaries of what was considered appropriate, to print.
The Spanish Wikipedia article mentions that he published, get this, excerpts from Helen Jewett's personal letters. Pretty scandalous for the time.
Right. And while some criticized him, called him unethical, he argued that he was giving the public what they wanted. Saw himself as a champion, bringing to light hidden truths.
And it worked. His newspaper circulation, it exploded during the Jewett case. He proved there was a market for this kind of reporting. And other newspapers, well, they followed suit.
This is when the penny press emerges. Newspapers sold for a penny, targeting a wider audience, the working class. And they relied heavily on sensational stories, crime, human interest, all to attract readers.
Amazing how this one case triggered such a massive shift in journalism, like the birth of the modern tabloid, right?
And that legacy, it's still with us. The 24-hour news cycle, the constant stream of headlines fighting for our attention, we're still captivated by these stories. Crime, scandal, human drama.
Shows that while technology changes, our basic human desire for these stories, it doesn't go away.
Important to remember that when we evaluate the news we consume. Ask ourselves, who's shaping the narrative? And what are their motivations?
We've been focusing on the trial, the media, but let's go back to Helen. What do we actually know about her life beyond her profession?
Good point. Easy to get lost in the sensationalism, forget that Helen was a real person with her own story.
The Spanish article, it says she was known for her beauty, her intelligence, her charm, a voracious reader, loved the theater. Imagine her, in those old theaters, completely absorbed in the plays.
A glimpse into her world, her interests, humanizes her in a way that the trial coverage never did.
Right, and there's more. It mentions a complex relationship with her family, regular letters to her sister, but kept her life in New York secret. It's like she was trying to build a new identity separate from her past. Makes sense considering the limited options for women back then.
It does. And here's something else. Even though she worked in a brothel, she had a certain independence. chose her clients carefully, saved her money, dreamed of opening her own shop someday.
That's ambition, resilience, striving for something better. It's just tragic that her dreams were cut short.
It is. But her story, even in its tragedy, reminds us there's always more to people than we see. Behind every headline, real lives, hopes, dreams.
We've talked about the societal biases of the time, but were there any specific laws, regulations that directly affected women like Helen?
Well, in the 1830s, prostitution wasn't exactly illegal in New York City, but definitely frowned upon, heavily regulated. Laws against disorderly conduct, vagrancy, often used to target women suspected of prostitution.
So not directly criminalized, but the system still made them vulnerable.
Exactly. And that vulnerability, it's clear in how the legal system treated the women who testified in the Jewett case. Words discounted because of their profession.
A clear example of how the law can be used to silence, to marginalize certain groups.
Raises the question, can there be true justice when the system itself is biased against certain people?
We've covered a lot: the murder, the trial, the media frenzy. But what about the aftermath? What happened to Robinson after he was acquitted?
Well, he went to Texas, tried to build a new life, changed his name, got married. But the Jewett case, it never really left him.
The Spanish article, it mentions he was recognized, someone who followed the case. His past caught up with him.
That's right. And while he never faced legal consequences, public opinion, it stayed against him. He died in 1879, still carrying that weight of suspicion.
A reminder that even if you're acquitted in court, you might not escape the court of public opinion.
And it shows how powerful this story is. Still fascinating, generating debate, even centuries later.
The murder of Helen Jewett, it wasn't just a crime, a cultural phenomenon. Exposed the underbelly of 19th century New York, and its impact. We still feel it today.
It's a story that makes us think critically about justice, the media, the biases that shape how we see the world.
We've talked a lot about the historical context, but I'm curious, your personal take on the case. What resonated with you most?
It's the irony of Helen's story, for me. A woman trying to make a life for herself, in a society that gave her very few options. And in the end, she becomes a victim not just of the crime, but of the biases that silenced her, overshadowed her story.
Powerful observation. Reminds us to remember the individual, the person behind the headlines.
And it reminds us that the fight for justice, for equality, it's ongoing. We need to challenge those systems, those structures that perpetuate inequality. Work towards a society where every voice matters.
We looked at the impact on journalism, but what about its influence on other areas? Literature, pop culture.
The Helen Jewett murder, it's fascinated writers, artists for centuries. A novel in 1849, plays, movies, even TV shows. This case, it tapped into something timeless, something that still resonates today.
The Spanish article even mentions it appears in Gore Vidal's novel, Burr. Amazing how this one crime from so long ago has had such a lasting impact on our culture.
It shows the power of true crime. It's a window into the past, you know. We explore social norms, values, even fears of a different era. And in Helen's case, it forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about 19th century America.
Absolutely. The inequalities, limited options for women, the consequences of defying expectations, it's all there.
It is. Makes you think, doesn't it? How far we've come and how far we'd still have to go.
It does. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought. We've talked about the murder, the trial, the media, but it all comes back to Helen Jewett, a woman who was more than a victim, more than a headline. Her story, even in its tragedy, reminds us to look deeper, seek understanding, and never forget the human cost of every story. Thanks for joining us. Makes you think, right? About how much things have changed, how much they haven't. It's almost 200 years ago, but it still feels so relevant.
It does, yeah. And it brings us back to Helen. We've talked about the trial, the media circus, but her life, her story, it's easy for that to get lost.
Exactly. So let's talk about her. What do we know about Helen Jewett, the person, not just the victim?
Well, the Spanish article, it paints a picture of someone who was, more than just her profession. It says she was known for her beauty, intelligence, even her charm. People described her as a voracious reader, loved the theater. Imagine her in those old theaters, caught up in the stories on stage.
It's a glimpse into her world, right? Her interests. It makes her real, not just a name in a headline.
Yeah, exactly. And it mentions her relationship with her family. Complicated. She wrote letters to her sister, but kept her life in New York a secret. You can almost feel the weight of that secret, that double life.
Like she was building a new identity in the city, leaving her past behind. Which makes sense, considering the limited options for women back then.
It does. And think about this. Even working in a brothel, She maintained a certain independence, chose her clients carefully, saved her earnings. She dreamed of opening her own shop someday.
Wow, that's ambition, resilience, wanting something more, a better life. It's just tragic that it was cut short.
It is. But even in the tragedy, there's a powerful message. There's always more to people than we see. Behind every headline, a real life, real hopes, real dreams.
And speaking of headlines, we talked about the impact on journalism. What about other areas? Literature, pop culture, did this case have any influence there?
The Helen Jewett murder. Oh, it's fascinated writers and artists for, well, centuries. A novel in 1849, it pops up in plays, movies, even TV shows. There's something about this case, it just keeps resonating with people.
The Spanish article even mentions it's in Gore Vidal's novel Burr. Amazing how one crime so long ago has this lasting impact on our culture.
It shows the power of true crime, right? It's a window into the past. We see the social norms, the values, even the fears of a different time. And with Helen's case, we have to confront some uncomfortable truths about 19th century America.
Absolutely. The inequalities, how limited women's options were, what happened if you defied expectations, it's all there.
It is, and it really makes you think, how far we've come and how far we still have to go.
It does. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one last thought. We've talked about the murder, the trial, all the craziness that followed, but it always comes back to Helen Jewett, a woman who was more than just a victim, more than a headline. Her story, even though it ends in tragedy, reminds us to look deeper, to try to understand, and to never forget the human cost of every story. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.